Hello, I'm Darren Moore from the University of Exeter. Along with colleagues from Exeter, Plymouth and Cardiff, I had the pleasure of leading the Implementation in Education Evidence Review that informed the Education Endowment Foundation's A School's Guide to Implementation Guidance Report. In this video, we are going to consider implementation outcomes in more depth. We will consider why implementation outcomes can be thought of as stepping stones towards improving pupil outcomes, and how different implementation outcomes will be relevant at certain phases of implementation in schools. For a fuller introduction to implementation outcomes, check out page 32 of EEF's guidance report and resources on our website, which explain them in more depth with examples and ways of measuring them. In short, implementation outcomes are measures of progress towards implementing evidence-based interventions in school. As implementation is often a long and complex process, it is helpful to be able to identify and measure these medium-term outcomes that can influence how well an intervention improves its intended outcomes, like pupil attainment. If a promising new approach is going to be successfully implemented in a school setting and eventually improve pupil outcomes, it stands to reason that we will need to know if those who will deliver the intervention believe that it is acceptable and feasible, and ultimately whether they adopt the approach. Buy-in from those affected by the approach is also important, and it helps that the approach is used with fidelity. These kinds of implementation outcomes can be measured, and they're stepping stones towards a final outcome the approach seeks to impact. It's not only common sense that positive implementation outcomes are necessary to see beneficial effects of an approach. Research that we reviewed also showed the relationship between implementation outcomes and pupil outcomes. We located a range of studies that demonstrate differences in the strength of intervention outcomes according to whether or how much an intervention has been adopted, sustained, or practiced with fidelity. If staff are not adopting an intervention, if it doesn't reach all the pupils who would benefit from it, and if it isn't sustained over time, we cannot hope to see an impact on pupils. So, implementation outcomes are necessary, but they also amplify intervention outcomes. The EEF's School's Guide to Implementation Guidance Report gives the impression that the more positive implementation outcomes are, the more final outcomes will be improved. This holds to an extent, but we should be mindful that those final outcomes might be worsened if a harmful intervention is actually implemented well. We can think about implementation outcomes more critically though, as they can also influence one another. Buy-in, which is the belief that an intervention will fit a need in the school setting and the motivation to want to see the approach in practice, is necessary for an intervention to have an effect. But we can also say that buy-in will be a stepping stone towards other implementation outcomes. Without buy-in, it is unlikely that we will see an approach adopted. Unlikely it is going to be used with fidelity, and even less likely it will be sustained. Therefore, it is helpful to think about the phase of implementation when these implementation outcomes might be key, both for the impact they have and as an indicator of when they need monitoring. It doesn't make sense to measure fidelity and whether the approach is reaching all of its intended recipients when a school is preparing to implement an intervention. So this can help us focus on certain implementation outcomes at certain times. Buy-in and acceptability, for example, can be important in the explore phase. They represent members of the school community's feelings towards and beliefs about an approach which is being considered. But as staff are preparing, they move on to consider the approach's feasibility and ultimately whether they are going to adopt the approach. Delivery allows measurement of fidelity and reach, this being whether the approach has been implemented across the targeted population, including the pupils that it should be helping. Later, we measure whether the approach has been sustained, although this can be predicted based on the implementation outcomes to date. The implication of this video is that we can and should be measuring these implementation outcomes at the right time and addressing any shortfall, not just to help final outcomes, but to improve further implementation outcomes. Buy-in is going to predict adoption. If staff don't think an intervention is feasible, it's unlikely it's going to be delivered with fidelity. We have other resources on how to measure implementation outcomes on our website. Given the importance of monitoring and taking action on these implementation outcomes, it will also be helpful to check out our resources on implementation strategies that will indicate the actions to take to help improve particular implementation outcomes. Thanks for watching. You can find other school implementation resources on our website. Please also get in touch with us there.